Mark Twain is reported to have said, quote, "The researches of many learned commentators have thrown much darkness upon this subject, and if they continue, we may be certain that we will soon know nothing about it at all." End quote. Welcome to As the Chaos Dies. The purging continues. The dissolution of all things is visible from here and draws near. The shaking grows stronger. The light purifies and intensifies as the chaos dies. Now, I'm not sure the exact context in which Mark Twain said that, but I think it's a very good way to introduce our study of the book of Revelation. Many people have said many things about the book of Revelation. And as Mark Twain so eloquently put it, many have thrown much darkness upon the study of the book of Revelation. And if this continues, we may be certain that we will soon know nothing about it at all. So our goal is going to be to analyze the book of Revelation using the academic material as much has been written on the book, and in doing so, hope to cut through a lot of the fog and a lot of the confusion that is out there about the book and come to some, if not unquestionable conclusions, at least some solid footing from which to interpret the book of Revelation. And many scholars have made similar statements to Mark Twain's comment, and theirs were undoubtedly about the book of Revelation. For example, G.K. Chesterton has said, quote, "And though St. John the Evangelist saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators." End quote. And Buist says, quote, "The book of Revelation functions as a kind of literary Rorschach test. An interpretation of it often tells us as much about the interpreter as about the message of the book." End quote. Now, interestingly, R.H. Charles has a different viewpoint. He says, quote, "The thought of our author is orderly and progressive and easier to follow than that of the epistle to the Hebrews or of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans." End quote. I thought that one was very interesting coming from Charles, as he views the book of Revelation as easier to follow than either Hebrews or Romans. But that's not the usual kind of a comment you would get from the academic commentaries on the book of Revelation. As we go throughout not just this particular video, but the entire Revelation series, I want us to keep in mind Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13 and verse 17, which says, "The one who gives an answer before he listens, that is his folly and his shame. The first to state his case seems right until his opponent begins to cross-examine him." Now, those are two important proverbs to keep in mind just in general life, let alone biblical studies. Because specifically when we're talking about biblical prophecy in the book of Revelation, many of us have been raised with a certain viewpoint, and we are so convinced that our viewpoint is correct without even giving the other viewpoints a chance that we discount them out of hand. Our viewpoint, whatever it may be, as it says in the proverb, it seems to be correct until the other viewpoint is presented, and possibly then we can see some validity in viewpoints that we may have never even been aware of or had dismissed without giving them a genuine hearing. So my goal in this study is going to be to present and interact with the various views and interpretations of the book of Revelation so we can try to make an honest assessment of the correct way to understand this book. And we don't want to conceal or ignore relevant data that will help us make better informed decisions in regard to understanding Scripture. That should be our goal no matter what book of the Bible we're trying to understand, and we're going to apply it here to the book of Revelation. And these are going to be, I'm going to do a series of introductory videos because the book of Revelation has so much background material and so much has been written by the scholars just in the introductions of their book. For example, I think Beale's introduction was over 170 pages. And so I want to get a lot of this background material out in the open up front, just so we know what we're getting into. So we will be doing a series of introduction videos. As Gregg Beale has noted, quote, "The crucial yet problematic task of the interpreter is to identify, through careful exegesis and against the original historical background, those texts which pertain respectively to past, present, and future," end quote. And that's the key to understanding, again, the book of Revelation, as he's saying. It's crucial, yet it can be difficult to identify when John is talking past, when he's talking present, and when he's talking future. As Robert Mounce says, quote, "The task of the contemporary interpreter is to read the symbols in the vocabulary of the first century, and then to interpret them for the 20th century church in terms of their final and complete fulfillment," end quote. And that's important, their final and complete fulfillment, as we're going to be talking a lot throughout this study about the types and typological precursors of the ultimate end-time fulfillments. And we don't want to lose track of that and view the precursor as the ultimate fulfillment. And that can be where it gets difficult. So in this part of our introduction, in this video, I'm going to go through the 4 main approaches in understanding the book of Revelation. There have been 4 main approaches throughout the history of interpretation, with nuances and certain details, subcategories, but 4 broad main approaches. And those approaches have been the Historicist view, the Futurist view, the Preterist view, and the Idealist view. So in this video, I'm going to give a summary of these 4 main approaches. So first up is the Historicist view. And this view views the book of Revelation as a pre-written record of human history from the time of the writing to the end of the world. This view holds that the book is currently, and has been since it was written, being fulfilled. And this was a common view amongst the reformers led by Martin Luther. And Luther's approach was followed by most Protestants well into the 19th century. However, this approach is very rare, if not non-existent, in modern academia. But also, however, as I've said, it was very popular in the past, and popular interpretive strategies for the book of Revelation seem to have a cyclical nature, ebbing and flowing through the centuries. So perhaps the historicist approach is due for a comeback. But even if it isn't, it's important to note how this view, or what this view is, because it was so popular amongst the reformers. As Merrill Tenney says, quote, the historicist view, which attempts to interpret the apocalypse by the development of the church in the last 19 centuries, seldom, if ever, takes cognizance of the church outside of Europe, end quote. So that's one of Tenney's main problems, or big problems, with that view. And Beale also echoes that criticism, that those who take the historicist view often just view the book of Revelation through the lens of the Western church, the European church. And I believe this is also a problem that must be addressed by those who want to see the 7 letters to the churches as being prophetic of all of church history. And I myself was raised with and do like that idea for the 7 letters. However, I think there are problems with it, and we will hopefully be able to make some sense of that, some of the issues with both pro and con of viewing the 7 letters through that lens when we get to that specific section of the book. And Buist Fanning, in commenting on the historicist view, he says, quote, "The measure of validity that can be found in historicism is best correlated with various typological precursors to the persons and events that Revelation portrays as part of the last days," end quote. And I agree with that statement. There have been and continue to be typological precursors that resemble the prophecies of Revelation, but these are not the ultimate fulfillments. History may not repeat, but it rhymes. And prophecy is pattern, but the fulfillment of prophecy must actually fulfill the prophecy, not just sort of look similar in a vague sort of way. And I think that is often, as we seek to and want to see the Bible prophecies being fulfilled in our own lifetimes, we can tend to see things happening and say this is that prophecy, when in fact it may just be a typological precursor. So for example, looking at Hitler during World War II, some thought that he was going to be the Antichrist. Well, he was not the Antichrist, but he was a type of the Antichrist, a persecutor of God's people, and one who sought to, gain control of the world and those sorts of things. So he was not the Antichrist, but he was a type, a typological precursor. As Fanning notes, quote, Revelation chooses to focus only on the culmination of God's kingdom coming to earth, not the centuries-long sequence of events that lead to it. Just as the events of 586 BC, 167 BC, and AD 70 foreshadow the attack of Jerusalem by worldwide forces in the final days prior to Christ's return, so other events of world history may prefigure the end-time events that Revelation pictures, end quote. And Fanning is a futurist, so that's pretty clear there from that statement as he's commenting on the historicist view, but he is a futurist in his interpretations of the book. But the criticisms of both Fanning and Tenney against the historicist view, I think, are legitimate. As I said, Beale agrees that's also, Beale doesn't like that interpretive strategy either, the historicist view. He tends to agree with the statement that I read before from Tenney, that view seldom, if ever, recognizes anything outside of the Western Church, the European Church. The next approach we're going to go through is the Futurist approach. And the Futurist views the majority of the book, usually everything after chapter 4, to be yet future, and they believe it will be fulfilled within a short period of time preceding the return of Christ. And this is the predominant view taught by popular authors, speakers, and YouTubers. And this view has so dominated the Western Christian culture that many Christians and virtually all non-Christians are unaware that other interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation even exist. So, when most people, both Christian and non-Christian, think about the book of Revelation, they think through the futurist lens, because this approach has so permeated our culture that it is eclipsed all the other approaches to the point that people are unaware they even exist within the mainstream, just the mainstream awareness of the book of Revelation. And as with most of these approaches, there are variations within the futurist camp. Some of these variations include the timing of the rapture and how literal to take the visions. The futurist approach is the most literal of the approaches, but even within this, there's variation in what is literal and what is symbolic. The futurist approach, not always but often, divides the book into 3 sections. Chapter 1 is the things you have seen, and this breakdown is based on chapter 1, verse 19, where the Lord tells John to write what you have seen, the things you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. So the futurist approach often views chapter 1 as the things you have seen, chapters 2 and 3, the things which are now, or the church age, and then chapters 4 through 22 are the things which shall be hereafter. And there are subdivisions within these final chapters that we'll discuss when we get there. The more that an interpreter desires to take Revelation literally, generally speaking, the more they will embrace the futurist approach, because futurism is the only approach that can take the book literally, because its prophecies have not yet been literally fulfilled in the past. So if you want to take the book literally, the passages about the sea turning to blood and the green grass being burned up and all these types of things that John sees, the abyss being opened, scorpion, locust creatures, these things have not happened literally in the past. So if we want to interpret the book literally, we're going to interpret it as yet future because we're looking for these things to happen and they haven't happened yet. So that's why futurism is usually the approach that is embraced by people who want to take the book literally. There are also, of course, many attacks on the futurist view, and I want to try to present the pros and cons of all these views. So the attacks of the futurist view, there are a fair number of those as scholars push back against it. And one of the attacks against futurism is based on its perceived origins. Francisco Ribiera was a Spanish Jesuit professor in the 16th century, and he taught that the first chapters of the Revelation applied to ancient pagan Rome, and the rest referred to a yet future period of 3.5 literal years immediately prior to the second coming. During that time, the Roman Catholic Church would have fallen away from the Pope into apostasy. Then the Antichrist would persecute and blaspheme the saints of God, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, abolish the Christian religion, deny Jesus Christ, destroy Rome, be received by the Jews, pretend to be God, kill the two witnesses, and conquer the world. And to accomplish this, Ribiera understood the 1,260 days, the 42 months, and the 3.5 years that the book of Revelation prophesies to be literal. And Protestants, for about 2 centuries, regarded the futurist and preterist approaches as Catholic inventions to defend the papacy from the reformers. And this is why the futurist approach was shunned by non-Catholics, because again, they viewed it as being invented by the Jesuits to defend the Pope. So while we could look at the things that Ribiera said, and even I would look at that and would agree with some of what he said, specifically the part about 3.5 years, and just a lot of the things that Professor Ribiera taught. I myself, being raised in the futurist camp, would look at those things and say I would agree with most of what he said. Maybe not the parts about the Catholic Church and the Pope and whatever, but just generally that outline, we could see that as being embraced by a lot of futurists. And because of this perceived connection to the Jesuits, again, Protestants have shunned the futurist interpretation largely. But this did begin to change in the early 1800s with Samuel Maitland, John Nelson Darby, and others, as Protestants began to embrace the futurist approach and started taking the book of Revelation more and more literally. However, some Protestants still view futurism with suspicion due to its perceived Jesuit roots. As Steve Gregg has noted, quote, apocalyptic futurism has been advocated by sound scholars such as Walvoord, Mounce, and Ladd, to be sure, as well as by innumerable cranks who have often given Bible prophecy a bad name by their repeated speculations, end quote. And that is also a very true statement. And in addition to Walvoord, Mounce, and Ladd, there are, Gregg did mention there are others, such as Fanning and Robert Thomas, and others. And these are legitimate scholars who do advocate the apocalyptic futurist view. But this view is often presented in pop culture, pop media, pop Christianity, and YouTube by people that are just making up nonsense. And it gives Bible prophecy a bad name and the book of Revelation a bad name because these speculations never happen. And so people look at the book of Revelation and prophecy as well and just discard it as nonsense. We've seen within recent years many people claiming the rapture is going to happen on such and such day, usually usually someday in September of various years, and you'll see all these YouTube videos pop up. The rapture is going to happen on this day, and then it doesn't happen, and so it throws a cloud on Bible prophecy in the book of Revelation. But as Steve Gregg also notes, quote, not all futurists approve of engaging in what some refer to as newspaper exegesis, end quote. Or just making stuff up, I would add. And another criticism, and this is specifically of dispensational futurism, is that the view renders the book largely irrelevant both to the original audience and to all Christians throughout the ages, since they weren't or won't be on the earth to witness the prophecies being fulfilled. Now, I don't think that's a legitimate criticism, and neither does Buist Fanning, and he says, quote, it is simply not true that holding to a pre-tribulation rapture makes most of Revelation irrelevant to Christians today, end quote. And we will get into the issue of the rapture as we go through the letters to the churches and various other passages in the book of Revelation where different people throughout the ages have thought they've seen the rapture, and others obviously disagree with that. So we will get into the rapture issue, of course, as we proceed later in the study. Another criticism of the futurist, another criticism of the futurist approach is that this view is immune to historical testing. Since this view holds that Revelation is mostly future, the interpretations offered by futurists are unverifiable and can be altered or pushed out further into the future as needed. We have seen this occur often, as at one point the Soviet Union was a favorite end times villain, but now the Soviet Union no longer exists. So all of those books and videos and whatever tapes are no longer relevant, because obviously the Soviet Union is not going to be the end time whatever they thought it was going to be, as it doesn't exist. And as we close out this section just talking about futurism, I want to read a section out of the Ascension of Isaiah. This is not the biblical book of Isaiah. This is an early Christian document titled The Ascension of Isaiah. I just want to read this just to give a perspective here on some of the ways that the early church viewed the book of Revelation. As I mentioned, some accuse the futurist approach as being invented by the Jesuits. But just listen to this from the Ascension of Isaiah and see if it doesn't sound like they were expecting a literal future fulfillment. And this is part of chapter 4 of the Ascension of Isaiah. And it says, quote, "These are the days of the completion of the world. After it is consummated, Beliar, the great ruler, the king of this world, will descend, who hath ruled it since it came into being. Yea, he will descend from his firmament in the likeness of a man, a lawless king, the slayer of his mother. This ruler, in the form of that king, will come, and there will come with him all the powers of this world, and they will hearken unto him in all that he desires. And at his word the sun will rise at night, and he will make the moon to appear at the 6th hour. And all that he hath desired he will do in the world. He will do and speak like the beloved, and he will say, I am God, and before me there has been none. And all the people in the world will believe in him, and they will sacrifice to him, and they will serve him, saying, This is God, and beside him there is no other. And the greater number of those who shall have been associated together in order to receive the beloved, he will turn aside after him. And there will be the power of his miracles in every city and region. And he will set up his image before him in every city. And he shall bear sway 3 years and 7 months and 27 days. And many believers and saints, having seen him for whom they were hoping, who was crucified, Jesus the Lord Christ, and those also who were believers in him, of these few in those days will be left as his servants, while they flee from desert to desert, awaiting the coming of the beloved. And after 1,332 days the Lord will come with his angels, and with the armies of the holy ones from the seventh heaven, with the glory of the seventh heaven, and he will drag Beliar into Gehenna and also his armies, end quote. So we can see just in that, that's kind of a brief summary of a lot of the things in the book of Revelation. So Beliar would be Satan, the dragon, as we see in the book of Revelation, and he comes in the form of a man, which, well, we'll get into the interpretation of the book of Revelation, obviously. So whether that is or isn't accurate, that's what they've said. So that would be more like the beast, or what's often called the Antichrist. And he would have miraculous powers, and he would have an image, and he will receive worship, and he'll bear swear 3 years, 7 months, and 27 days. I'm not sure exactly where they get that from, but that's seems to be they're taking that literally, as around 3.5 years. The people who are believers in the Lord Jesus Christ will be persecuted and will flee from desert to desert. So that sounds kind of like Revelation 12. And then at the end there it mentions 1,332 days, which again I'm not sure where exactly they're getting that number from. But the Lord will come with the armies of heaven, sounds like Revelation 19, and drag Beliar into Gehenna, which sounds again like when the beast, the false prophet, are thrown into the lake of fire. So we could see this from this early Christian document, the Ascension of Isaiah. They sure seem to be taking it literally, and we're expecting it to happen in the future. So I thought that was very interesting and wanted to mention that as well. The next approach is called the Preterist approach. And Preterism is still pretty popular today in various forms. So there's Preterism or partial Preterism. Partial Preterism is more widely held than full Preterism. But Preterism in general holds that the book of Revelation was either totally, partially, or mostly fulfilled in the past. And again, that depends on which branch of Preterism you're in. If you're a full Preterist, the book was fully fulfilled, or a partial Preterist thinks that certain sections of it were historically fulfilled. So partial Preterism seems to be the majority view among conservative evangelical Preterists rather than full Preterism. And partial Preterists believe the first half of Revelation's prophecies were fulfilled at the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The second half predicted the fall of Rome, and the final chapters in the book are yet future prophecies of the second coming of Christ. A very similar outline to that which I just described was introduced, just like the Futurist approach, by a Jesuit scholar in the 16th to 17th centuries named Luis de Alcazar. And he taught that chapters 4 through 11 were fulfilled at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Chapters 12 through 19 were fulfilled by the fall of pagan Rome in AD 476. And chapters 20 through 22 represented the triumph of the Church of Rome under the Pope. And as I mentioned, the Protestant reformers were skeptical or hostile to the preterist view because, again, just like with futurism, they believed that the view was invented by the Jesuits in order to try to protect the Catholic Church and the Pope. So historically, the Protestants were also hostile towards preterism for the same reason they were hostile towards futurism. One of the pro statements for preterism is that the view has the advantage of immediate relevance to the original hearers, which I think is something that we definitely need to state as truth. The book had to have meaning to the people who originally heard it. When John penned it and sent it out to the churches, it had to mean something to them. And that is one of the arguments in favor of preterism, is that the entire book would have had relevance to the original hearers. Again, because if you remember, one of the critiques of futurism is that it only applies, or mostly only applies, to future Christians and not to the original hearers. Advocates of the preterist approach claim this view is the only one that can take literally the various times throughout the book that John is told the time is short, that these things must shortly come to pass, or that they are about to take place. And John is told not to seal the prophecy for this very reason. Revelation 22 verse 10, John is told, it says, "Then he instructed me, do not seal up the prophetic words in this book, for the time is near." The other approaches must offer various explanations as to why these statements don't mean what they seem to be saying. And I emphasize what they seem to be saying, because when we get to chapter 1, we will talk about this, of course, as this is one of the serious interpretive issues that we need to get across, one of the hurdles we need to get across in order to recognize how we're going to interpret the book of Revelation. What does it mean when John is repeatedly told the time is short or these things must soon take place? So the preterists say that they're the only ones that take that statement literally, because they're the only ones that believe that the entirety of the prophecy, or the majority of it, was going to soon happen for the original hearers. However, as we discussed with the historicist view, typological precursors may explain these perceived discrepancies. Just as Jesus used the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of, which was typologically fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes, to point to something yet future, so Revelation's prophecies could have a near-term typological precursor with a yet future ultimate fulfillment. And that is what the majority of the futurists, at least the ones that I've read so far, tend to think. That there's a typological precursor, a typological fulfillment in history that points to the ultimate fulfillment yet future. Some interpreters believe that the book of Revelation is John's expanded version of Jesus' Olivet Discourse. And the preterist approach links the Olivet Discourse to the destruction of Jerusalem. And so by linking the Olivet Discourse to the destruction of Jerusalem, and then saying that the book of Revelation is just an expanded view of the Olivet Discourse, they then link the book of Revelation also to the destruction of Jerusalem. However, this approach to understanding the Olivet Discourse, and specifically Matthew 24, is by no means the only approach, as the futurists also heavily rely on Jesus' Olivet Discourse for their eschatological understandings as well. And one of the main arguments against preterism is that it requires the early date of writing, which is by no means certain, and in fact the majority of scholars, as well as the preponderance of early church testimony, holds to the late date. Without the early date, the book cannot be a prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction. And I'm going to do an entire video on the dating of the book of Revelation. But just briefly here, the early date, the date that preterism basically requires, is that the book of Revelation was written before 70 AD. Because it can't be a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in 70 AD, if it wasn't written before that. But this date is not held by the majority of current evangelical scholars, and it was also not held by the early church. The overwhelming view of the early church, and modern scholars as well, was that the book of Revelation was written during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, which was well after the destruction of Jerusalem. So again, without this early date, it cannot be a prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction because it was written after Jerusalem was destroyed. And another important problem with the preterist view is that neither the destruction of Jerusalem in the 1st century nor the fall of Rome in the 5th century fit the universal judgment that Revelation predicts. As Thomas Schreiner says, quote, "It is difficult to see how the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple would resonate with Christians struggling to handle their own issues in the province of Asia. Nor is it easy to see how they would feel that their faith was vindicated by such an event. Indeed, John says nothing about the prophecy that Jerusalem would fall, which is hard to square with a preterist reading," end quote. Another attack on the preterist approach is that it was invented by the Jesuits, and I mentioned this one, previously as well. But while Alcazar may have formulated an outline similar to what some modern preterists believe, he didn't invent the idea of attributing some of the prophecies of Revelation to the fall of Jerusalem, as there are early Christian commentators from the 6th century that mention that this was an interpretation advanced by some in their own time. So the attack that dismisses preterism as an invention of the Jesuits is not accurate. And one final issue that some raise against preterism states that if Revelation was prophesying the fall of Jerusalem, the letters would have been sent to Jerusalem, not 7 churches in Asia. Now, I don't think this is a relevant objection either, because Jesus himself warned Jerusalem that its destruction was coming. And that's recorded as well in history, as Eusebius records, quote, "The people of the church in Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it, to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. To it, those who believed on Christ traveled from Jerusalem, so that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea," and then he goes on from there. He continues in, Eusebius continues in what he was talking about. But this objection that against preterism that states that the letters would have been written to the church in Jerusalem if the book of Revelation was prophesying Jerusalem's fall, I don't take that to be a legitimate criticism of preterism. Now, I myself am not a preterist, but I don't think this is a legitimate criticism of preterism. Eusebius's testimony is also confirmed or echoed by Epiphanius, and he speaks of, quote, "the exodus from Jerusalem when all the disciples went to live in Pella, because Christ had told them to leave Jerusalem and to go away since it would undergo a siege," end quote. And according to church tradition, John ministered in the same region these churches are located, so it would make sense for him to want to send letters to those he oversaw. So again, church tradition teaches that John settled in Ephesus and ministered to the churches that Paul had written letters to. So it only makes sense that he, as one of the overseers of these churches, would be sending letters to them, not to the church in Jerusalem, which he was not one of the overseers for at that time, according to church tradition. And the last view, the last approach, is the idealist approach. The idealist approach understands the book of Revelation as a great drama depicting spiritual realities. This view sees the fulfillment as either entirely spiritual or as representative and therefore applicable to Christians in any age. This view does not look for literal fulfillment, either historically or in the future. As Buist says, quote, "The idealist approach is correct in finding timeless principles about God and his dealings with humans in the book of Revelation. The book teaches a great deal about God's character as holy and his sovereign rule over his creation. Its instruction about Christ's divine being and the redemption and victory he accomplished by his sacrifice comes across clearly, apart from resolving issues about the chronology and specific symbolism. The sinful stubbornness of humans and their need for repentance and submission to God's ways also shows through. The church has always discerned such spiritual and moral truths in the book. But idealism is wrong in refusing to see specific persons and sequences of events portrayed in John's visions. These two, timeless truths and specific reference, are not mutually exclusive." And I think that's a good point that Fanning makes there. It's not mutually exclusive. And often commentators, I think most of the ones that I've read so far, are all a mix of these approaches. And I think that will probably, that view makes, that approach, I guess, makes the most sense, is that the book of Revelation is going to be a blend of these things. Because as Fanning said, it's not mutually exclusive to see the universal truths that the book of Revelation is communicating and a historical end-time future fulfillment of the prophecies. It's not mutually exclusive to see that. So my view is that the biblical prophets often synthesized a near vision of historical events imminent in their own time with a far vision of the day of the Lord in future events distant from their day. We see that throughout our study of the prophet, at least I do, that the prophets often saw a near term and a far term. Whether or not they understood that, that's what seems to have been what they were recording. That some of the prophecies of Jesus, they would blend his first coming and second coming. Well, since we see that the second coming prophecies of Christ have not yet happened, then we still look for them, because the prophecies that happened at his first coming literally happened. So we are waiting for the future, his second coming, to fulfill the rest of the prophecies. At least that's my view, and that's how I'm planning on approaching the book of Revelation. That John saw, the things that he saw were relevant to the people at the time that he wrote the book. But his ultimate vision was of the day of the Lord and the future that is yet to happen. And Carson and Moo, in their introduction to the New Testament, they refer to the correspondences of past and future as prefigurements of the eschaton. So again, things that happened in the past were prefiguring the end of the age. And I want to end this video, this section here, with a quote from Robert Mounce. And I think his insight here is very, very interesting and very good. He says, quote, "It is interesting to note that these varying approaches are, to a considerable extent, an accident of history. The author himself could without contradiction be preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist. He wrote out of his own immediate situation. His prophecies would have a historical fulfillment. He anticipated a future consummation, and he revealed principles that operated beneath the course of history. The interpretive problem grows out of the fact that the end did not arrive on schedule," end quote. I think that's a very interesting statement. That all of the approaches to understanding the book of Revelation could have been applied to John. And the reason that they've kind of all fractured out into different camps of people arguing about this view or that view or this approach or that approach, is because the end did not arrive, quote unquote, on schedule. And what he means by that is if you study the history of interpretation of the book of Revelation, many people believed that it was going to be fulfilled in their own lifetimes, and when it didn't happen, these other approaches were adopted or emphasized as an explanation as to why it didn't happen when they thought it was going to happen. So kind of because it didn't happen in our lifetime, then maybe we're not supposed to take it literally. And so, the idealist approach sort of nudged out or overshadowed all the other options to some people. Or because it hasn't happened literally, then we're supposed to look for a historical fulfillment, and it's just describing in rather symbolic language the course of human history until the end times, or something like that. So we can see that as people seek to have Bible prophecy fulfilled in their own days, or they see things that lead them to believe that the end times are happening right now, when that doesn't happen according to what they thought, they then abandon certain interpretations of the book of Revelation, kind of because they, maybe become jaded. And we can see that in our own day, as many people kind of tended to think, or I guess popular end-time prophecy, as it was becoming popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then a lot of those things that they said were going to happen didn't happen. A lot of people have abandoned a futurist interpretation of Revelation in favor of preterism or idealism or not historicism, as that one's really not advocated too much today, but idealism and preterism have grown in popularity because of the way that some people have proposed to understand the futurist position. And hopefully that won't be the case in as we go through the book of Revelation, trying to be more sober and more balanced in understanding what John is trying to communicate, so that we don't fall into one extreme or the other, as that's not usually the correct way to understand things within prophecy. As Fanning noted, as I mentioned, that a lot of these approaches are not mutually exclusive. You can blend them in various ways, and Fanning actually gives an example of how to blend them. So I wasn't planning on adding that, but I think I will go through the way that Fanning does blend the views, just as an example of how we can view the book of Revelation. But before I do that, I just want to note that many modern interpreters overlook the distinction between the historical fulfillment of prophecy and its eschatological fulfillment. That was noted again by Mounce, that as we have a certain view that we are going, if we approach it as we have our view and we are going to overlay our view onto the text rather than letting the text inform our view, we will have blinders on and our interpretation will be skewed. And so we want to be careful of that. So with that being said, as I mentioned, I wasn't planning on going through Fanning's, the way that he suggests that these various approaches can be blended, but I do want to do that now because I think it could be useful. So we'll do that as we close. And this is taken from page 49 of Fanning's Revelation commentary in the Zondervan exegetical commentary on the New Testament series. So page 49, Fanning says the following, quote, "A typological approach to John's use of the Old Testament in Revelation helps to explain how John's imagery can refer to realities in the first century world as well as in the final climactic period prior to Christ's second coming, i.e. a preterist futurist reading. The pattern can also be seen as repeated in some measure in various situations involving persecution, temptations, apostasy, or fidelity on the part of God's people as they live in anticipation of his return, and then culminating at that time, i.e. an idealist futurist approach. It also clarifies how Old Testament expectations about ethnic Israel can be, as some interpreters phrase it, universalized to include the whole world, i.e. escalated to their ultimate extent without excluding the expected fulfillment for Israel. The typological pattern is expanded to include all the nations as the Old Testament anticipates in various places, without abrogating Israel's special role in bringing God's redemption to its consummation, and then participating in that consummation as an ethnic entity," end quote. So that's how Fanning suggests that these various views can be combined to an extent. So he believes that preterist futurist can be combined, as he said, by recognizing the imagery that was relevant in the reality of the first century, as well as a final climactic period prior to Christ's second coming. So that's how you would blend preterist futurist. And then, as multiple of the guys have noted, as that I've quoted, it's pretty easy to blend idealist and futurist, as that those two just seem to go together as long as you're not determined to exclude one or the other. Those two seem to blend pretty easily into a reading of the book of Revelation. So with that, we're going to end this first piece of our introduction to the book of Revelation. Thank you all for listening, and I will talk to you very soon. God bless.